A look at the present, 2017, and the future developing from it. Translation by Vivienne, Legg and Mariann, Uehlinger, 30th January 2018.
Today I want to talk about something about which I have had many thoughts lately, and because I had two visions about which I have also made probability calculations. However, these result in a different wise to all the prophecies and predictions which partly already stem from the 1940s, the 1950s, 1960s, and also from later years, and are predominantly contained in the book Prophecies and Predictions. Very many predictions which are mentioned in this book, as well as many other things which I have done in letters and bulletins in terms of predictions, have come about since then and are also presently happening, as will also be the case in the future, however. But now I have some other things of the future that I have calculated according to my two visions, and if thereby in my elucidations and explanations, and so forth, I include mightful ones of state, indeed governors and politicians, as well as the miseries which prevail with them in the business of state leadership and so forth, then that relates in every case solely to the fallible ones of the state leadership, and so forth, and to their fallibilities. And I say that because I am absolutely conscious that there are also amongst the mighty ones of the state, the governors, the civil servants and politicians, and so forth, certainly good human beings who are conscious of their duty, who give their best and do good, and endeavor to fulfill their job norm and their work quota according to their best ability and capacity. I am also absolutely clear about how the state laws, rules of regulation, and ordinances are entirely justified and are, on the whole, correct. Consequently, there is nothing in the negative to object to, just as is also the case in regard to the righteous mighty ones of state, civil servants, governors and politicians, and so forth. Consequently, my statements, explanations and criticisms are to be understood as me denouncing solely the machinations of the majority of the unrighteous state leaderships, civil servants and politicians, and so forth, who practice their office only for the sake of their might and for the sake of remuneration, not for the sake of the well-being, right condition, freedom and peace of the people. Furthermore, I criticize also only the laws, rules of regulation and ordinances, and so forth, which are wrong, hostile to human beings and freedom, as well as illogical, and not and in no wise all that which is right, good and effectively necessary in terms of laws, regulations and ordinances, and all that which falls into the frame of correctness regarding the laws, regulations and ordinances as well as the state leadership, and so forth, lets the human being, to a large extent, live well and in peace and freedom and also in a certain security, as is at least the case with us in Switzerland. But that is no longer to be taken for granted in the current time with the ever more emerging serious criminality, the constantly increasing felony and the ever-spreading terrorism, as well as the arising anarchism, which unfortunately is not yet recognized by those in positions of responsibility, as well as the growing racial and religious hate, the generally growing unpeace, the breakdown of the families, and with the humanity of the earth, everything is simply becoming crazy because everything that they do is completely idiotic. Because the more human beings populate the earth, the more are still begat and set into the world, and the more extensively the mass of the overpopulation increases, the more the public service is counterproductively cut and limited. So, for example, the administrative service, which additionally squeezes more and more dues out of the citizens for all kinds of services and even the least ones, whereby also the official paperwork warfare is ever more complicated. Furthermore, also the public bus services and the state and private train and road services and the public transport connection options are more and more drastically limited, whereby the cost for using them is constantly raised. Also, more and more train stations and bus and tram stops as well as post offices are cut, as are banks and bank branches which demand ever higher dues for their customer-friendly administration work. Also, hospitals and doctors' practices and so forth are closed in ever greater numbers, while all the others which remain impose tremendous costs and they literally rob the patients. But this continues in the same frame with the corporation bosses, company owners, chiefs, professional sportsmen and women, especially footballers, and administration councils and so forth, who demand increasingly immense undeserved payments, whereby the single remuneration recipient in this regard receives millions, which are said to be over 10 and 12 million Swiss francs per year. This is so, while the normal employees, each accordingly are fobbed off and got rid of with just 3,000, 4,000 francs or euros per month, or, in better positions, with 10,000 or 12,000, although it is basically these who effectively do the hard work, while the high-position, big-mouthed bosses laze around in their flashy chairs and barely lift a finger and only do their big talking. All are only bent on wangling immense financial means and obtaining horrendous fortunes. Also, newly elected imperious rich ones again and again busy themselves getting elected as people's representatives into the governments, where they then increasingly financially burden the peoples by exploiting them with new taxes of all kinds, be it with added value tax and sales tax and so on and so forth, because to them it is only important that they bleed the citizens through the tax system and that they themselves can pocket and rake in horrendous undeserved wages and, later, lifelong high pension amounts. This is the case while those of the population who have to work hard and with low wages for their living have to pay horrendous taxes until resting causes them pain. And thereby even the elderly are not spared, who live or have to live or vegetate on meager pensions and from state support payments, because even the support payments from the state still come with horrendous taxes, wherethrough they have to live in poverty and cannot afford anything which would correspond to their needs. Indeed, what should one call those governors other than imperious state morons and state criminals, who presumptuously and arbitrarily again and again invent new taxes in order to exploit the taxpayers on one hand, and on the other hand, to fill the state coffers so that they themselves can pocket horrendous wages and, later, pensions which amount to many times that which the effective working people have to earn with hard and arduous work. And so that it is said clearly, by state morons and state criminals I do not mean the righteous governors and civil servants, rather effectively only those exploiters of the people, who use their positions to exploit the hard-working population again and again with new taxes as well as with official and state stamp duties and clerical fees in order to therewith fill the official and state kitties and even to pocket horrendous payments themselves and to live in splendor and joy and to be able to do everything while the working class merely eke out a living and the poor have to miserably starve. And that is unfortunately also the case in Switzerland as well as in all other countries, in which certain unrighteous ones in the government, as imperious elements over the heads of the righteous ones of the remaining governors, do everything in order to financially exploit the population through new taxes and dues, and so forth, and to enrich themselves through undeserved wages and pensions. Whether this is through general, direct or indirect taxes, through higher road levies and motorway permit stickers, tolls and especially deplorable thereby is that the righteous ones of the governors let themselves be condemned by these conscienceless and people's hostile elements, who were elected into the governments due to their populistic machinations to keeping silent and holding their tongues, or letting themselves be influenced and persuaded to participate in such people's exploit machinations. And this is a rampantly spreading disease which has taken hold far and wide and spread out everywhere, and indeed also in the entire non-official and non-state areas and indeed practically in all private and economic realms, such as in regard to post, doctors, hospitals, home care and other care organizations, banks, dentists, businesses and tradespeople and so forth. The entire matter in this regard is however not only criminal, rather felonious, because therethrough, financially felonious and conscienceless as well as money-greedy elements squander increasingly immense wealth in every way that is allowed by the state. They position themselves high above the working class. They control them and operate an uncontrollable felonious capitalism, to which the workforce, that is to say, the females and males who are effectively the workers, have to bow and have to let themselves be exploited by the principal sharks. Naturally, that is not understood by the entire work population and indeed by the entire population. Consequently, it continues in this sorrowful frame and the entire workforce becomes ever poorer, underpaid and increasingly exploited and does not defend itself from that, while the big capitalists and others who rake in millions become ever richer and wealthier. And the peak of the whole thing is still that the righteous and rational ones among the authorities and governments do nothing against that, rather simply take part in the same frame, which however can also only happen because, like the citizens and indeed the populations, they simply let everything happen without putting up a fight against this deplorable state of affairs. And they do that as a consequence of their blind belief in their authorities and governments, because they are thus imprisoned by their religious faith in the authorities and by their bondage to them, and are also no longer capable of thinking and acting for themselves. Rather only let the authorities and governments as well as the political parties think for them and are nothing more than the ones who receive and carry out their orders. And since that is the case, the citizens are effectively no longer free human beings, rather they are serfs of the authorities, governments and parties, which no longer have any civil courage, who cowardly, like beaten dogs, increasingly let themselves be coerced into unpeace and lack of self-initiative. The human beings of today have become totally without initiative. Consequently, they also no longer defend themselves, or only if worse comes to worst when they no longer have anything that would be worth defending for themselves. And if it actually comes so far that they awaken out of their lethargy, then they irrationally completely flip out, go berserk, and in a kind and wise become so mobile that gets totally out of the control of the good human nature, that they flip out in a blind rage, smash everything to pieces in evil and blind anger and cause more harm than good. Then the factor of intellect and rationality, which is in the process of getting out of control, only allows blind hate and unbounded anger which can no longer be counted by any consideration, because any clear ability to think, any insight and every ability for cognition, all discernment, all astuteness and all ability for discernment deteriorate to such a degree as a consequence of brutality, resentments, unsatisfaction, pathological craving for revenge and hostility and so forth, which are getting very badly out of the control of the good human nature, that there is only action of an absolutely uncontrollable, blind raging and fanatical form. One can only still hope then, in this state, that, after the unavoidable Ausadongen, at least something still remains in existence and finally intellect and rationality are again victorious, to be able, with much work, expenditure and effort, to again bring everything in the correct state and make progress. However, it must thereby be an actual fact that the small clique of might-obsessed, the super-rich and capitalistic wealthy, to which the world belongs as a consequence of their financial might, can no longer control it. If this happens, then it must clearly be regulated that the entire population of the earth are no longer governed through capitalism, rather that in the future the peoples determine the world happenings in true democracy and regulate everything such that equality rules for all human beings in every respect, and indeed also in regard to the wages, so that some do not have to waste away poor and in misery, while others, stinking rich, can live and rejoice in splendor. But that stipulates that the human beings of the earth wake up from their lethargy of twilight sleep, begin to think for themselves and use intellect and rationality in order to also stop the globalization, which is bringing further terribleness, which has progressed so far already, through capitalism and indeed especially through the capitalist bosses and their money-greedy machinations, that also nature is involved in devastating wise and is brought into uproar. Therefore the entire terrestrial population, that is, the entire humanity, must finally learn to think independently and clearly, and not allow the elite and political parties as well as the capitalist mighty ones to think for them, but rather make an effort entirely themselves for independent thinking. And independent thinking is based in the human being, on one hand, searching for information from as many different sources as possible, collecting it and assimilating it in order, on the other hand, to then compare it and to draw his or her own conclusion from it. Independent thinking is not only desirable, Rather, it must be the human being's duty. Consequently, he or she must demand it of himself or herself, whereby this ought to be actually basically learned very early in the education, and then also through his or her self-education, because only therethrough is the possibility created to form his or her own opinion. Unfortunately, however, it is the case that very many human beings, even when they are already grown-ups, are not able to form their own opinion, because they have never learned to think independently. And also with topics which are central for them, these human beings are not able to have a say, are not able to think about them, and also are not able to form their own opinion. Consequently, they are also not able to question the opinions of others. Rather, they simply adopt them without consideration and thereby live in the delusion that these opinions are correct and also are their own. However, human beings who are not able to think independently are generally not capable of recognizing an independent thinking as such, because in reality this is generally not available, rather is only a product of the acceptance of thinking which is from outside and is preaching. Recently I had two visions regarding this and also in regard to the distant future, which were extremely horror-striking and made me shocked. Consequently, I have made myself deeper thoughts about all the perceived factors and the coming effects, and also carried out probability calculations concerning what can arise from everything in the future, and that looks not only absolutely unpleasant, but rather catastrophic and leads to a future Armageddon. Accordingly, I have some things summarized, which above all are connected with the rampantly growing overpopulation, which, through its machinations which inevitably become ever crasser, will lead to ever more catastrophes in the whole world. This was indeed also announced through prophecies as well as mentioned in the Prophecies book, in which predicted monstrous firestorms in the United States of America, where, for years, ever more evil firestorms prevail, which destroy and eliminate entire villages and districts as well as landscapes. That is indeed also the case at the moment, since a mighty firestorm with fire tornadoes has destroyed and eliminated, down to the ground, several villages and already far more than 6,000 homes, along with also other buildings and also forests. But what I have calculated by means of probability in regard to the insanity of the overpopulation in the future, if it actually all comes about according to my calculations, represents on its own a tremendous catastrophe of humanity such as has never before occurred. The whole thing will, however, still be preceded by diverse extremely unpleasant factors, which I, however, only want to explain subsequently to that which will come about in the future, according to my visions and calculations, as per the greatest catastrophe of humanity, when possibly actually an extermination of humanity by means of Gaval will occur on a grand scale, if it really happens, brought about and executed by the mighty ones of the state and the capitalist elite, and so forth. Therefore I begin with the results from the view based on my calculations which, with some things, amount to an approximately 34% probability, but with most around 56%, which however could in some circumstances each claim, whereby however already now the danger with this percentage exists that these probability possibilities can occur. This percentage data already has as a result that the entire happening, if it really still increases and actually occurs and therefore becomes reality, will be so monstrous in the future that, for the normal human being, everything will be as good as incomprehensible and will not be surmountable. Then I will now state all that which I have calculated in terms of probability according to my two visions, whereby I will begin with that which will lastly occur, should my visions and probability calculations fulfill themselves. Only after that I will name diverse factors which will entirely bring themselves together to that end, which will be unavoidable if humanity does not quickly change to the better in order to introduce a worldwide stop to births and a birth control and also democratic citizen-based governments. There, however, all unrighteous elements of the state, government, administration and politics must be removed from their offices and replaced by effective powers who are close to the people and are righteous, who carry out their offices in line with the citizenry and namely affect the business of government of every kind democratically and according to the pure will of the people. But what I have to say and have calculated using probability corresponds to a somewhat extensive case that I have already written up, because the whole thing would be too extensive to remember. Therefore I can read everything here from the computer and now present the results of my visions and probability calculations, and namely the following.
Number 1. The great misery and end of the overpopulation story will be that it will be recognized by the world of lit that the maintenance of their might can only be guaranteed by the overpopulation being drastically reduced, whereby this reduction of the humanity in the future time threatens to be carried out in felonious wise by the mighty ones of the world if the growth of the mass of the overpopulation is not ended in the foreseeable time through a drastic worldwide stop to births, and if a world-encompassing birth control is not arranged. The mighty ones of the world, that is to say, the state authorities, the dominators of the peoples and mighty capitalists, which as such form the world's elite, who on the whole are also blended by their strongly religious sectarian belief and also will be in the future, will be much more malicious and worse in the kind and wise of their actions than the war and humanity felonies which happened through the NACI horror. This future world mighty elite will know no mercy and carry out a humanity elimination which could not be more horrible. And according to probability, various possibilities for that show, such as that the diverse traditional death-bringing rapidly spreading diseases are adapted and prepared with deadly new active substances. However, also that artificially created illnesses for the decimation of the humanity will be used. In the same way, the calculations indicate that infectiously working poisonous biological substances will be used and their deadly effects presented as new and unhailable rampantly spreading diseases, whereby these poisonous substances then penetrate into the entire organism via the airways and the mouth as well as via the skin and mucous membranes, where through inevitably unstoppable mass deaths will come about. Also deliberately caused famines and wars. Poisonings of the food and of the water will belong to the arsenal of the decimation of human beings to the point of a governable minimum, which will occur worldwide, therefore not only in individual murderous and dictatorially led countries. Also a thermonuclear war for the depopulation of the majority of the mass of the earth humanity must be taken into consideration, in order to reduce it so much that it can again be governed. Consequently from that also a murder of peoples, that is to say, murder of humanity, can come about on a scale as has never before happened.
However, according to my probability calculations, before all this happens, the following uncertainty will come about.
Number 2. Generally there exist already today in the entire world extremely complicated changes, and they will broaden in the coming time. And they will have state, political, capitalist, military, economic and citizen-based consequences, called forth through the might behavior of the incapable ones who, through wrong decisions, mismanagement, might claims on other countries, suppression of freedom and of peace, give reason in many regards for uprisings and revolts in their own countries and so forth.
Number 3. The small and large countries in the whole world will equip themselves militaristically with the most modern weapons to a degree never known before, whereby instead of peace, freedom and security, the entire thing will generally increasingly become a danger of quarrels with neighboring countries and armed conflicts and wars.
Number 4. Generally in the entire world, increasingly serious attacks on the police organs from anarchistic groups of the population will occur and also claim human lives, along with the arising of the destruction of state property, which eventually might also lead to militaristic engagements against the corresponding groups when the security organs no longer have them under control.
Number 5. along with the United States of America and Russia. China now also raises itself into the position of world politics and now, since the Korean War, leaves the purely observing, passive and watching position, which until now was its traditional position, and changes into a self-confident, great and world might and to the again blossoming new Chinese nation with an impressively growing economy, whereby on the world political stage, the Socialist People's Republic of China no longer makes a secret of its ambitions as leading might and great might and so forth, and in every regard will, to a great extent, militaristically heavily arm itself.
Number 6. Everything concerning refugees will continue to increasingly claim in the future, wherethrough finally on the earth 250 to 350 million human beings will leave their homelands as refugees and spread themselves throughout the world. Regarding this, especially Europe will bring forward the whole thing as a consequence of the mismanagement through the low intelligence of false humanitarian governors and groups of the population, wherethrough new afflictions and illnesses are called forth and will spread confusion, whereby also the hostility towards foreigners will increase, as will the race hatred, religious hatred and sect hatred, the criminality and the felony.
Number 7. The coming times bring many technological developments, which will however evoke both benefit for the humanity as well as disadvantage and harm. Nature and its fauna and flora, that is to say the entire ecosystem and the climate, will be increasingly destroyed through the felonious machinations and outgoing effects of the overpopulation, which are getting very badly out of the control of the good human nature, and indeed as a consequence of the rationality-less approval given for it by the governments in regard to the environment-destroying machinations. So for that also the state mighty ones, governors and politicians are responsible, often also the military as well as the lobbyists, privately acting persons, populists and all other ones who take actions, who with their growing might and their filthy fingers reach into the governments and play their part in continuously destroying nature, its fauna and flora and the climate. Altogether additionally broken down everywhere will be the inhibition level, which could still prevent much gavolt, which comes forth in increasing form through ausotungen, unconcernedness, hate, unpeace and envy and so forth, as the malicious consequence out of the growing overpopulation, as also out of their machinations. Evil fights over resources arise between the countries and will lead to war and armed conflicts. The rapidly increasing technical development as the phenomenon of the progressive time in the 21st century will be underestimated in its negativity, because it will bring great dangers with it, through which ultimately the future of the entire humanity and thereby also that of the future generations will be put at risk.
Number 8. Worldwide, again and again, new countries will fall into turmoil, because in them citizen-based and separatist-formed rioting will arise, which will lead to serious domestic political and economic insurgencies, excesses as well as to gavolt and confusion.
Number 9. As it has been since time immemorial, it will also be in the coming time that the God-believers fight, hate and make enemies of each other, and indeed, not only the believers of diverse religions, rather also of the sects, wherethrough also in this wise again and again, belief-based quarrels and terrorism flame up, and malicious unpeace, hate as well as wars, massacres, and forced displacements, suffering, affliction and misery will come over the humanity. And that will happen and will repeat itself as long as religions and the sects which result from them exist, and also new ones will form.
Number 10. The governors, the mighty ones of the state, and the politicians, of whom a great part already works in a populist form, whereby also lobbyists play a part, however, fall into increasingly diverse forms of populism, and come to might with populistic inciting, deceitful promises, and with lies they lead the populations into confusion, and, through wrong leadership, into affliction, difficulties and doubt, as well as into unregulated states that are destroying the right conditions and are state endangering, whereby in Europe along with Switzerland, in which unfortunately also diverse populists and lobbyists can perform their mischief, to the detriment of the rights and freedom of the citizens. Also Germany and naturally the European Union dictatorship, as well as especially France, England and Holland and also Austria, because of the populists and lobbyists in the governments and amongst politicians. The population has its rights curtailed, is disadvantaged and exploited through new charges and taxes and so forth, and will also be in the future.
Number 11. The public media of all kinds also will increasingly become a populist factor of might through whose machinations and since the populations are influenced and steered in a media populist form, whereby through the media and its might, false information which serves them is spread and the population is led into delusion.
Number 12. Populistically created and steered conspiracy theories and mendacious reporting will increasingly come about and will lead the populace of all countries into confusion and make them believers of all those who, by exploiting the people, attain horrendous profits from the whole of the conspiracy lies and at the same time control the population.
Number 13. The political risks increasingly dramatically climb, as also in regard to the humanitarian matters, the economic problems, the entire national economy and corporations, whereby also great dangers exist through wars and the international terrorism risk, and thereby also security risks play great roles.
Number 14. Today's and the further coming world situation has become so dangerous that it is already in many a wise more dangerous than at the time when the Cold War still prevailed, and from now on will broaden out more.
Number 15. In the absolute foreground of all coming evil, negative, and bad changes through interference in foreign countries' internal and external affairs, happenings, modes of action, conflicts, problems, and so forth, is the United States of America with its pathological craving for world domination, which, obsessed with might as it has been since its beginning, increasingly interferes in the interests of other states and their domestic and foreign political affairs, concerns and interests, and thereby provokes disturbance, unpeace, wars, and other armed engagements.
Number 16. Positive confederations, connections, agreements and contracts between diverse countries and organizations, and so forth, set up and having come about as a result of considerable effort, will partly or totally disband and fall apart, whereby often the United States of America will be the driving power for that, and therethrough again and again stir up new enmities between countries as well as great insecurity, disturbance, unpeace, revolutions, and the danger of war.
Number 17. In the future, the United States of America and the U.S. governors will be exposed to very frequent threats, which will come from both state and non-state acting persons who are hostile towards the government and state, as well as from great parts of the U.S. population, whereby the U.S. population will split into different population groups for which the basic factors have already been created, and consequently the U.S. population already in the current time separates into different groups.
Number 18. Again and again there arise new hostilities between diverse countries, which lead to political and economic differences and to evil and destructive wars and armed engagements. As a result, a Fourth World War constantly has to be taken into consideration again and again. In this regard, the United States of America's criminal and felonious world domination affectations and world police affectations, as well as its political machinations, are especially in the foreground as the driving power.
Number 19. Worldwide, diverse countries get increasingly on the edge of a collapse in regard to public policy, while an intensification of the bad security situations internally just as externally, through extreme terroristic and military as well as dictatorial machinations, will climb.
Number 20. In spite of other efforts of the government, Russia will be the target of terrorists, whereby especially Islamic attacks from the autonomous regions Dagestan and Chechnya will threaten.
Number 21. For the sake of their greed for might, and in order to maintain it, the nuclear weapons states will carry out wars with atomic weapons as well as with other weapons of mass destruction, and thereby spread affliction, death, misery, destruction, and elimination over the entire earth.
Number 22. Natural resources will become such rare materials that the countries will trigger and wage wars about them which get very badly out of control, whereby quite especially certain great mighty nuclear weapons states will apply their deadly weapons without scruples.
Number 23. The prosperity of the entire humanity will be threatened, already in the current time and more than ever in the future, through authoritarian tendencies of the elites of the governments, the politicians, populists and the capitalists, whereby inevitably also societal signs of decay will go hand in hand with it.
Number 24. The earth whom mankind will bring about the most unscrupulous and life-disdaining and human-disdaining systems of rule, as have never before appeared on the earth, whereby the executors of the rule and regency, those greedy for possessions and the mighty capitalists will steer the ship of humanity from one catastrophe to another.
Number 25. The terrorism, with both a religious sectarian, political form as well as human hostile and state hostile form, will increasingly take the upper hand worldwide, and the deadly and destructive terrorist attacks of all kinds will demand more human lives all over the world and will call forth destructions with a gullible nature. The entire worldwide terrorism will strike again and will become a nightmare for the earth humanity.
Number 26. The political risks increase worldwide and threaten to very badly get out of the control of the good human nature with regard to instability, all kinds of armed conflicts as well as wars and acts of terror, wherethrough also in this regard the terrorist danger which has got very badly out of the control of the good human nature will increase considerably and will drive the world to the edge of a collapse.
Number 27. Worldwide, the incessantly growing overpopulation and all the maladministration systems of all kinds and in all areas will continue to drive the numbers of unemployed high and achieve forms which will call forth tremendous problems, as has never been the case with any earlier times of unemployment.
Number 28. In the whole economy, wages for the employees will sink very low and call forth monstrous financial problems in all levels of the population of the workers' world, whereby also the whole social services will suffer harm, breakdown, and all around also the rapidly increasing criminality will call forth tremendous problems.
Number 29. Through speculators a global financial and economic crisis will be called forth, such as has never before occurred. Consequently also the entire world of finance will get into great trouble, and also much terribleness and great lack in regard to economic goods will come about.
Number 30. Also in the United States of America the population shall get dispossessed as a consequence of the worldwide financial crisis, which will lead to the incensed and partly heavily armed population being advanced on by military and police powers with evil gavolt.
Number 31. The plan ban on cash shall bring about the dispossession of the populations, while, however, the elite of the governors and of capitalism can, for their part, swim in joy and splendor. And the entire financial system of the entire world shall be toppled, in order thereby to newly arrange all existing state debts of all countries, and indeed such that generally only the populations of the countries come to harm. Already in the United States of America and in the European Union dictatorship, there exist secret plans to start a war from Germany against Russia, which shall be named as the reason for the entire arising worldwide crisis. And that thereby the blame for this war is to then be shoved onto Russia, naturally completely unrightly, if it actually comes about, is clear right from the start. And if this war actually occurs, then from that martial law is deduced, which suppresses the incensed population, which will be completely dispossessed, through strong and ruthless military and police powers.
Number 32. Already today countries exist which in truth only correspond to nominal states and which are effectively no longer independent states, rather only exist in name as such and no longer have any kind of their own state authority. Basically that solely concerns open areas which teem with criminal bands and which are controlled by guerrilla fighters and warlords. Also, Europe corresponds to an era which is besmirched by criminality and felony, but which is additionally controlled by the European Union dictatorship, which is the highly dangerous dictatorship which contributes very much to the instability of the international politics and also is a starting point and, at the same time, a will-less tool in the hands of the international terrorism, and is the point from which threats of military revolt will go out in the future. But from the European Union dictatorship also criminal and felonious machinations through criminals and felons start out, and will come out in greater measure in the future, such as trade in drugs, human beings and weapons, whereby, as time goes on, less and less correct conditions can be brought about.
Number 33. There will be efforts made to dispose Greece's population as will also be attempted with other countries when the opportunity arises.
Number 34. The pension offices will no longer be able to dispense pension payments because their financial means come to an end, and indeed, on one hand, as a consequence of the higher age of the pensioners, on the other hand, because their number increases due to the increasing mass of the overpopulation, and altogether also the costs of living climb, and there be also the pension requirements, the raising of which and even the payment of which will however be more and more in question.
Number 35. Many countries will get into pecuniary trouble due to nonsensical financial expenditure and financially overcommitting, wherethrough the entire state structure and banks as well as the economy will collapse as a consequence of inevitable bankruptcy.
Number 36. Worldwide all social systems will collapse, as a result of which more and more human beings fall into the deepest poverty, can no longer enjoy health care and will also die of hunger and misery, because they can no longer finance their living costs and therefore also their own food and health.
Number 37. In the future, independent and sovereign countries will be appraised as the greatest threats and enemies for us America, whereby as it has been for as long as can be remembered, Russia, from the confused U.S. viewpoint, will be increasingly proclaimed the greatest danger for the American security.
Number 38. Increasingly, immense quantities of the most modern heavy weapons will be brought to Europe by the United States of America, and be stationed in Germany and in the countries bordering Russia. But Russia does not simply accept this and arms itself with its own atomic arsenal and also all other weapons as well as the Russian army. That is, the entirety of the Russian military.
Number 39. Already today there are not only two world mights, the United States of America and Russia, because there are also diverse regional great mights, which are partly armed with nuclear weapons and which have international affectations, whereby the European Union dictatorship stands ahead of all of them, then also Brazil, India, Japan, Nigeria and South Africa. However, with that the insecurity grows for all countries in the entire world, because all armed themselves more and more, and indeed not simply to protect themselves from attacks, rather also in order to possibly attack neighboring states.
Number 40. Worldwide the populations of many countries will become ever more unsatisfied due to the arising state miseries, and will oppose and protest to the point of having insurgencies, from which the danger of civil wars will arise.
Number 41. The lives of the governors and financial leaders, who rule in a lax and wrong as well as a lead, might greedy, selfish and imperious form over the populations will no longer be secure, and they will be forced to defend their lives as well as their goods and possessions, which will only be possible, if it is at all, when they have themselves protected by bodyguards or even their own mercenary force.
Number 42. Worldwide, the elites of the governors and of the moneyed aristocracy, together with corrupt politicians, will set up totalitarian and dictatorial surveillance states, and thereby preserve their dominance.
Number 43. The world of finance will increasingly promote capitalism, whereby it will all get very badly out of control in nationalistic form. That is to say, fascistically, in order to prevent and choke off other systems which may appear and arise against capitalism.
Your visions and probability calculations connect with calculations of the same kind which I already made 3 decades ago and which can actually come to fruition, if nothing changes to the good and right in the entire terrestrial world politics, government forms, the entire economy and overall behavior of the earth human being peoples as well as in their intellect and rationality. And belonging to that which must be done toward the good and right are also effective, drastic and lasting regulations which are to be made and carried out very quickly for a worldwide stop to births, and a decisive birth control in order to bring the humanity again to a mass which can be coped with by the planet and nature, which for Earth amounts to 529 million, whereby however, for the decimation of the Earth humanity, a number between 1 and 1.5 billion will be calculated, as my own probability calculations from 3 decades ago showed. My probability calculations 3 decades ago naturally showed a lesser percentage of possibility, namely, only that of around 47.7%, which however has massively climbed since then. I have not carried out foresights concerning the calculations in this regard, but also my probability calculations reveal, as yours do, that they actually show a certain greater possibility of occurring as predictions. However, this will broaden if everything does not significantly change in the entire political, economic and general world happenings, as well as in the general overall behavior of the earth human beings in regard to their intellect and rationality, and if no progressive and logical modes of behavior and actions come about which can guarantee a healthy continued existence of the earth humanity.
That is interesting because I did not know that you also have made such calculations and that, with my calculations, I have now reached the same kind of results as you have in yours. For me that means that in our calculations there must be at least a greater probability in regard to a fulfillment. But back to that which I have calculated in regard to the mighty ones of state and so forth and the capitalists in the future time not being able to govern the peoples. As I have calculated, the beginning of that was indeed made many decades ago. And in order to recognize that and understand it, one must look back only to the 19th and 20th centuries, in the course of which, in all the world, big and national, uncontrollable felony organizations have come about which have monstrous might which they even wield in the business of state. But the fact also is that the leaders of state increasingly govern in a form that bypasses the welfare and interests of the peoples, whereby already today such a discrepancy prevails between the governors and the populations that no agreement can be found anymore, and everything can only fall into an even deeper misery than is already the case. And contributing to that is also the whole party system which is split up into various interests, instead of being structured into an agreeably logical, peaceful unity based on intellect and rationality as well as progress and the bringing of advantage.
I also see it thus.
Precisely, and what I want to say in regard to the disturbing and disgracefully unpleasant condition which has been prevailing already for a long time in all countries, is that especially prominent are those organizations of felons which neither the security agencies, such as the police and so forth, nor the authorities, mighty ones of state and military can touch. For the most brutal organizations of felons of the world, in the foreground are gaval, might, murder, trafficking of human beings and drugs as well as homicide, all possible organized crime and effectively religious sectarian fanaticism, which has completely got very badly out of the control of the good human nature, against which nothing has been able to be done anymore in a legal and righteous way for around 200 years already. Most of these gangs and organizations of felons, which are not only criminal, rather are effectively felonious and do not shy away from anything, were not only founded in Middle and North America, in order to defend ethnic interests, rather also in Europe, in Arabia, Asia and especially in China and Japan. In the meantime their influence worldwide has spread so uncontrollably and has so strongly increased, that in all the world also their brutality, mercilessness and consciencelessness, the murder and killing as well as unscrupulousness and the gaval, which has maliciously got very badly out of the control of the good human nature, have grown and increasingly take the upper hand, where through the earth humanity is increasingly and incessantly tyrannized. Such deadly dangerous organizations of felons indeed have existed since time immemorial and again newly appear. But since the beginning of the new time, in the year 1844, they have become more and more numerous and worse, and indeed also in regard to the techniques of torture, murder, homicide, and gaval, whereby since then additionally also the new techniques of all kinds are used. In part, these organizations of felons have networks which stretch across the whole world and no longer terrorize only single countries, rather all terrestrial countries, without them being able to be seriously countered as a consequence of their branching. For example, the religious sectarian political terror network Al-Qaeda and the Islamistic State, which both, as the worldwide form transnational terrorism, have great parts of the world as their target in view and who want to forcefully bring about the change of the international economic system and system of rule with evil torture, gaval as well as murder, killing and destruction. And that will also remain so in the future, even though the IS has been conquered and destroyed in Iraq and in Syria, because the Islamistic State, which is felonious in regard to humanity, and Al-Qaeda, have spread, established themselves and divided up into many different groups in the whole world in such a form that a clear oversight of them no longer exists, and it is also no longer clear which are terrorist organizations they can be associated with. However, one thing is certain, namely that behind this terrorism there is a religious sectarian delusion and fanaticism which demands the blood and the death of innocent human beings because they are of a different religious belief or belong to other levels of society or other peoples. Along with that, there is, however, still a whole range of other forms of terrorism, such as national terrorism, which is limited in its results and radius of action to the territory of one country, such as is the case, for example, in regard to the Maoist movement in Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and in the Philippines, and also was with the RAF in the Federal Republic of Germany. Then to be mentioned is the international terrorism, which has determinations which are of an internal nature concerning the country, but whose radius of action, however, extends far beyond the country's border, which is why also non-participating third parties become victims, as is the case with the Abu Sayyaf terror organization of the Philippines. But in regard to terrorism, there are still other forms, such as social revolutionary terrorism, right-wing terrorism, ethnic terrorism, nationalistic terrorism, homemade terrorism, that is to say, homegrown terrorism, a conservative vigilant terrorism. Vigilant equals watchful, clever, agile, resourceful, smart. Sense of justice terrorism, based on an injured sense of justice. State terrorism and eco-terrorism, whereby still a range of further forms of terrorism exist, which would be too many to list, however. Still to mention, however, would be the gangs and organizations of felons which are known worldwide, such as the Mafia in Italy and in the United States of America and so forth, Yakuza in Japan, Hells Angels, the Triads in China, the Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, Aryan Brotherhood in the United States of America, Mexican Mafia, Black Guerrilla Family, that is, Black Family, that is, Black Vanguard in the United States of America, the Crips in the United States of America to Canada, and finally the Blood Alliance, that is, Bloods in the United States of America, along with many others.
Except from the 691st contact conversation of Friday 20th, October 2017 between Billy and Pataha.
But something else. For years we have spoken again and again privately about future things, as I have recently done openly in regard to my probability calculations. However, that which we have discussed privately each time, we have consciously done so in order not to predict things which could stir up anxiety amongst the human beings of the earth. But now 9 days ago, I still told some things with my probability calculations, simply that which can happen in the future, as also in regard to biological weapons and biological rampantly spreading diseases, as well as artificially evoked illnesses and rampantly spreading diseases about which we have indeed also often talked. Thereby also the swine flu, Ebola virus and SARS virus, that is to say, pandemic, and so forth, were spoken about. According to your explanations, these rampantly spreading diseases were not expressly intentionally made, as is claimed to the contrary by conspiracy theorists. Rather, they were passed to the human being in the form of viruses through the eating of wild animal flesh and also through contact, through the faces of and the injury of and caused by wild animals. And indeed this has happened through bats and so forth, as is the case, for example, in regard to the different forms of the swine flu and Ebola. In this form, the transmission of many other illnesses to human beings from animals, insects, amphibians, birds, reptiles, and diverse other life forms has occurred, whereby bacteria and viruses mutated and adapted to the human being in a virulent form. During one conversation, you said, according to the 598th Contact Conversation of the 4th October, 2014, the Pleiadian Pleiarens Contact Report, Volume 14, page 10, the following.
Regarding that, I can explain the following. The Ebola virus was passed to human beings from animals, as was also the hay virus. Concerning the HIV, the small green guanons, form of ape, were the carriers of the virus, and concerning the Ebola virus, the first sources of infection were bats, flying foxes and apes. From the Ebola virus comes the so-called viral hemorrhagic Ebola fever, connected with internal and external bleeding. Ebola arose through the consumption of game meat and the contact with animals which were infected with the Ebola virus, which also continues to be so. Also, a passing from human being to human being is possible, whereby for an infection it is sufficient to have body contact as well as direct contact with the blood or other bodily fluids of one who is sick with Ebola or has died from it. Also, the rampantly spreading disease can be transmitted over short distances through the air, and therefore infect human beings, as also a perspiration can be enough for an infection, if a human being comes in contact with it. Also, certain biting insects can possibly pass on the Ebola virus as well as diverse small and larger forms of animals and creatures, and so forth, if they are infected with the Ebola virus. Along with that, the Ebola virus can be stored on all kinds of objects, such as dishes, door handles and toilets, and on other things, whereby the virus can survive and infect for up to 2 months. On the other hand, as you also explained, rampantly spreading diseases, SARS for example, also arise through uncareful laboratory experiments, during which bugs, that is to say, viruses, are released. And exactly with that, with the laboratory experiments, I want to come to the point which, among other things, I have addressed in my probability calculations under point 1, as follows.
But this future world mighty lead well know no mercy and carry out a humanity elimination which could not be more horrible. And according to probability, various possibilities for that show, such as that the diverse traditional death-bringing rapidly spreading diseases are reworked and prepared with deadly new active substances. However, also that artificially created illnesses for the decimation of the humanity will be used. In the same way, the calculations indicate that infectiously working poisonous biological substances will be used and their deadly effects presented as new and unhailable rampantly spreading diseases, whereby these poisons then penetrate into the entire organism via the airways and the mouth as well as via the skin and mucous membranes, where through inevitably incessant mass deaths will come about. Also deliberately caused famines and wars. Poisonings of the food and of the water will belong to the arsenal of the decimation of human beings to the point of a governable minimum, which will occur worldwide, therefore not only in individual murderous and dictatorially led countries.
But now to that which we have for years again and again had as a topic of discussion and did not openly speak about, since I have now openly mentioned with my probability calculations that which is quoted in the excerpt, The question now arises whether now something can possibly be said about the fact that for a very long time that which is concealed in this excerpt has been tinkered around with. Your question is probably justified, for which reason I estimate that now it can be openly spoken about and corresponding information can and may be released. Consequently, I will give my opinion on it straight away. The fact is that already for many decades a criminally and feloniously disposed part of the earth, humanity, and also certain other social elements of it, can no longer be kept under control and can no longer be stopped through laws and punishments, and they are also no longer governable. For a very long time the terrestrial population has therefore been in such a desolate state in regard to a still effective governance, that generally all efforts for regulation of those responsible in the governments and other higher elites as well as of the security forces, increasingly fail, for which reason, for a long time already, ways have been searched for in order to counter the evil in a lasting form. Thus, already a long time ago it came about, as I already explained to you in 1996, that a certain group of high elites got together and set up a plan for the solving of the excessive overpopulation problem and made a decision which, in the long term, tends towards a drastic reduction of the earth human beings. The secret plan regarding this, which already was conceived around 20 years ago, is based exactly in that which you have calculated as probability, namely, that biologically based epidemics and pandemics, in the form of illnesses and rampantly spreading diseases, are to be made, and that has been worked on already in a secret society form, since the decision at that time. Thereby the decision was to people specifically collect, naturally illegally, the deoxyribonucleic acid of the earth human beings, in order to biochemically change the biomolecules and carriers of the genetic information of the different peoples which occurs in certain virus types, so therefore the genes, so that a deadly outcome would be inevitable when the spreading of the illnesses and rampantly spreading diseases occurs. However, the reason why everything pertaining to the necessary data is people specifically collected, clarified, researched and prepared, lies in the fact that if the future point in time for the reduction attack against the earth population comes, the action will happen according to the state of the overpopulation of each people. That means that then, according to the excessive state of each population of a people, diverse measures will be taken and provisions made for the reduction of the population in order to spare and retain a certain number of the population. These will then be under the strictest control of the high elites and will only be permitted to beget descendants in controlled forms determined by law, in order to avoid a new emergence and development of another overpopulation. To that end, then also legal regulations and extremely harsh punishments will occur for breaches against these legal directives, which can also be directed against body and life. And the decision for the mentioned collection of data had already been put into practice a long time ago, secretly, and indeed already around 2 decades ago, whereby also work has proceeded for a long time to test in small frames as an experiment already created new and initially harmless and periodically appearing forms of illnesses, especially those which are periodical and spread broadly in epidemic form, respectively, which emerge temporarily and plentifully in particular localities. The great application of such deadly substances shall then one day happen, by and by, in such a form that everything is to appear in the form of an epidemic and pandemic, and indeed as with traditionally emerging illnesses and rampantly spreading diseases. After that, entire particular peoples shall be specifically infected to a great extent with particular biologically created new and deadly illnesses and rampantly spreading diseases in order to well and truly wipe them out to a determined minimum. And it is unfortunately a fact that tests in this form already occur, although these attempts indeed still exist in the very first beginning phases. However, they will lead to effective results in the foreseeable time.
Yes, that corresponds to that about which we have often talked many times and about which you recently said that the probability calculations in regard to the actual coming and becoming of this humanity reduction already amount to a high percentage, as said, that in the future time everything will comprehensively thus occur.
That is correct. The present probability calculation amounts to around 51% that it will thus come about.
Then that is also clear. Thank you for your explanation, and I think 51% probability is already very much, and if the overpopulation continues to increase so rapidly as has been the case for years, then everything can move to the climax very quickly and lead to the calculations being fulfilled. If nothing is therefore undertaken in order to stop the massive increase of the Earth humanity, and to bring it under control, then for their future, that is to say, for our distant descendants, very much terribleness will approach on the destiny horizon, and the then small humanity will perhaps become bondservants to the upper elites. And for that their forebears will carry the blame, that is to say, the current humanity and its descendants, who imperiously continue to breed up the overpopulation and in no wise care about the future. And the majority of the current and future Earth population does not only not concern itself about the prosperity and adversity of their descendants, rather it also does not concern itself about their descendants, and in turn their descendants and all distant descendants.
Which really can become possible if they continue to live in an intellect and irrationality. And what you say regarding how the current Earth humanity does not concern itself about the prosperity and adversity of its descendants, and also not about their descendants and, in turn, their descendants, and so forth, corresponds to an indisputable fact.
That which comes forth in terms of terribleness, despotism, criminality, hate, felony, murder and manslaughter, terror, tyranny and contempt for human beings, and so forth, and indeed already from children who are no longer raised, from young ones and adults, is reported on daily, worldwide, by the news agencies, and indeed along with that which one perceives, sees and experiences oneself when one goes through the villages, cities, and through the streets. And the bad thing about that is actually that the whole majority of these children, young ones and adults, still are religious believers and sect believers, and are dependent on their belief and act according to this delusion, precisely according to the pathologically and abnormally dumb religious sectarian irrational teachings: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or, as it is said colloquially, if you don't want to be my brother, then I'll smash your head in. Since time immemorial it can be seen and experienced and lived again and again that, as a rule, the believers of religions and sects are the most malicious, brutal and worst earthlings, when it concerns their own well-being, possessions and their rights. If they feel that they are in the right, then they quickly engage all means in order to claim their right, be it through unseemly, impolite, offensive and cursing insults, revilement, material, reputation-based or psychical infliction of harm, hate, slander, stalking, legal proceedings, reporting to police, as well as physical or weapon-based gavolt. And if wars are carried out, then the deadly weapons are blessed, in a religious sectarian form, in the name of a blood-greedy God, so that, through these, as many innocent human beings as possible are to be killed and bestially butchered. Thereby that which is preached to the confused believers of religions and sects is fulfilled. Namely, the reality that love for the next one, love for the human being, peace, freedom and humanity in the religious sectarian belief-based sense are only empty phrases which are only used in order to outwardly simulate a false self-righteousness, in order, however, on the inside, to be an effectively bestial devilish individuality. And all this in the name of a so-called loving, however imaginary, God, for whom the believers go through the fire and resort to gavolt and weapons in order to senselessly harm their fellow human beings and impose sorrow, misery, torment and disadvantage and rejection on them. This is the case on one hand, while, on the other hand, they spread their malicious terribleness through lies, insults and slander, and so forth, for which they do not even feel guilty, for which they however do something, namely, that they give their might in regard to collections of money and goods for the needy and distressed, and so forth. And they thereby live in the delusion that, in regard to their falseness, lies, gavolt, insults, and slander towards their fellow human beings, they have done their duty and are consequently free from guilt. They can possibly spend their entire life thus, and, in their mind, be believingly free and peaceful. Naturally, also in this regard, I must be honest and say that, with that which I have said, I talk absolutely only of the majority of those who are brain-amputated ones who have fallen into belief delusion and God delusion, who immediately flip out, snap, resort to gavolt into weapons and go crazy if in some wise they see a use for themselves in that and believe that they are given the right therefore to harm and impair, hold back and paralyze any fellow human being and to proceed against them with gavolt or even in a deadly form. I speak only of this majority, however in no wise of the minority of the religious believers and sect believers who take their God delusion belief extremely seriously and endeavour to lead their life and existence righteously according to all the good which their belief is laid down for them to live, act, and behave in line with, such as having to lead their life in real love for their next one, in feeling for others, honesty, peace, freedom as well as in kind-heartedness and dignity and so forth. My words are not intended for these believing human beings, nor are they directed at them with evil ulterior motives, because if they maintain their belief righteously in this mentioned wise and lead their life accordingly and also express it in their existence, then they have, in complete sincerity, my complete high respect and esteem.
I know that, however, I think that I do not have to provide any commentary in regard to all your explanations.
It is not necessary.
Except from the 692nd contact conversation of Sunday 29th October 2017, between Billy and Pater.